Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get to the heart of history's biggest turning points. Today, we're tackling the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But forget the usual story, crumbling walls, barbarian hordes storming the gates. We're going deeper, looking for the internal cracks, the hidden failures within Rome itself.
Right. Most people think, Rome falling, they immediately picture the 5th century, Alaric, Attila, the so-called barbarians. Yeah. But honestly, if you only focus on those external pressures, you miss the real story. That's just the final act, the paint peeling off.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of flip that script. We're setting aside the invasions for a bit. We want to dig into that complex pileup of internal economic and social mistakes, the systemic rot that made Rome so brittle in the first place.
Yeah, the core idea here, based on what the sources suggest, isn't that Rome was simply overpowered by outsiders. It's more like, economic and social self-destruction. The decay didn't start on the frontiers, the cold borders. It started deep inside in the farmlands, the tax records, and maybe the saddest part, in the choices ordinary citizens were forced to make. The empire was essentially hollowed out from the inside before the final blows landed.
Okay, let's start there then with that fundamental failure you mentioned, the economic betrayal. Rome should have had the resources, right? But the money wasn't there. Where did it all start to go wrong fiscally?
It really kicks off with a catastrophic failure in tax collection. Simple as that sounds, it was devastating. The central government needed huge amounts of money for the army, the administration, everything. But the wealthiest people, the big landowners, the elite, who arguably benefited most from Roman stability, they basically managed to challenge the central government and, avoid paying their fair share.
Hold on, how did that happen? If the empire was still, nominally in charge, how could the richest people just refuse to pay taxes? Didn't Rome have systems, enforcers?
Well, that's where you see the power shifting. As the central state weakens, local power grows stronger. These powerful landowners, these local bigwigs, they just use their influence. They could intimidate tax collectors, bribe officials, find loopholes. It became systemic. And when the wealthiest group in society basically opts out of supporting the state loses its authority and its funding all at once. That's maybe the first big forgotten error, and it really starts the whole downward slide.
And this power vacuum, this lack of central funds, it leads straight into this thing called the villa system. Sounds almost quaint, but the sources painted as something quite destructive.
Oh, it was. It was a huge systemic failure disguised as local efficiency. What happened in the later empire is that the economy shifted dramatically towards these huge self-contained agricultural estates. The villas. They became the main economic and even political hubs out in the countryside.
Self-contained meaning? They made everything themselves. Food, tools, clothes, all within the estate.
Pretty much, yeah. And here's the killer flaw for the empire. All that economic activity, the production, the commerce within the villa's walls, it was considered a private matter. Because goods weren't really entering the big imperial markets or traveling long distances anymore, it just decimated taxable commerce. Central tax revenues dried up, and people's loyalty shifted away from the distant emperor towards the local family head, the guy running the villa. He was the one providing security and sustenance now.
That's incredible. It's like they were dismantling the empire's funding stream, the very thing paying the soldiers who were supposed to protect them just to hoard wealth locally.
Utterly self-defeating in the long run. And the effects just cascaded. Less revenue meant the central government couldn't guarantee security, so banditry exploded on the roads, piracy became rampant in the Mediterranean. This lack of safety then choked off what little long-distance trade remained, making the self-sufficient villa seem even more necessary as a safe haven. It was a really vicious cycle.
And when a system's under that much strain, even smaller things can push it further off track. Which brings us to this really strange point the sources raise about lead poisoning.
Yes. Now, obviously it wasn't the single cause, but it's a factor that gets mentioned. The argument is that the Romans used lead for everything: water pipes, cooking pots, lining wine vessels, even as a sweetener sometimes. And this widespread exposure might have led to chronic, low-level lead poisoning, especially among the urban elite. It suggested this could have subtly impaired judgment and rational decision-making in a ruling class that was already dealing with immense crises. It's a grim thought.
Okay, so we've got economic breakdown, tax evasion, maybe even impaired thinking. Now let's shift to what the sources call the most tragic social error, the end of the free citizen. This feels like it goes beyond money into the realm of loyalty, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This hits at the traditional heart of Roman power. We're talking about the small, independent farmers and landowners. Historically, these were the guys who filled the legions. They had a real stake in the Republic and then the early empire because it felt like their state. They had a powerful reason to fight for it.
But the state, starving for cash because the rich weren't paying, turned on these very people. How were these free farmers actually crushed?
They got caught in a terrible bind. On one side, crushing centralized taxes, which the government tried to collect with increasing brutality precisely because the wealthy weren't paying. On the other side, just general insecurity and sometimes the violence of the tax collectors themselves. So they faced this awful choice. Keep your land, keep your nominal freedom, but risk losing everything, maybe even starving or face state violence. Or give up your land and your freedom to the local big landowner, the villa boss, who had his own armed retainers in return for protection and basic survival.
Wow. So they essentially traded freedom for security, becoming serfs, bound to the land. Their loyalty shifts completely from the emperor to the local lord.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a few people. It was a massive social shift. It fundamentally changed Roman society. Millions of citizens justifiably felt the empire wasn't working for them anymore. It only served a tiny, greedy elite. This created deep disillusionment, despair, a kind of passive social rebellion. People focused on survival, on dodging taxes, not on contributing to the wider good. And critically, Rome lost the very people who had the deepest motive to defend the empire.
And this isn't a new problem that just popped up in the 4th or 5th century, is it? The sources draw a line back much further, even mentioning figures like the Gracchi brothers in the late Republic.
That's a really important connection. Way back in the 2nd century BC, the Gracchi tried to push through land reforms. Their goal was to give public land back to the poor, to try and revive that small farmer class, which was already under pressure then. But they were assassinated. Their reforms failed. The Republic and later the Empire never really solved that fundamental issue of wealth inequality, where military expansion enriched a few but displaced the many.
So the final collapse, centuries later, the one we're talking about, was in some ways the endgame of that original failure, the failure to maintain a broad, invested middle class.
You could absolutely argue that. The rise of the villa system just kind of formalized that power shift that had been brewing for centuries. It cemented the dominance of local lords and the disappearance of the independent citizen farmer. Rome just never figured out how to distribute the benefits of its own success, its own security, to the majority of its people.
Okay, so the internal structure is rotten. Tax system broken, society fragmented, loyalty gone, legions filled with mercenaries who fight for pay, not patriotism. Then and only then do the external groups really manage to land the knockout blows. Let's touch on them, but keeping this perspective of internal weakness. First up, the Goths.
Right. The Goths, both Visigoths and Ostrogoths, essentially provided the military proof that the game was up. The key moment was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. The Visigoths didn't just defeat a Roman army, they wiped out a huge chunk of the Eastern Field Army and killed the Emperor Valens himself. It was a shattering blow, proving the borders weren't really secure anymore. And importantly, the sources suggest the Roman army by then was heavily reliant on mercenaries, lacking that old citizen-soldier discipline.
That was the military shock. But the symbolic one, the one that really sent ripples across the world, came a bit later.
Yeah, 32 years later in 410 AD, when the Visigoths under Alaric actually marched into Rome and sacked it. It was the first time in something like 800 years that a foreign enemy had taken the city itself. Psychologically, that was immense. It told everyone, Romans and non-Romans alike, that the imperial shield was broken. Later, the Ostrogoths would set up their own kingdom right there in Italy, basically taking over the administration.
Okay, so Goths deliver the military and symbolic blows. But you mentioned the Vandals delivered the economic death stroke.
This is absolutely critical. The Vandals, led by this brilliant, ruthless King Gaiseric, did something audacious. They crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 AD. And why was this so devastating? Because North Africa was, without exaggeration, the breadbasket of Rome. Yep. Losing North Africa meant losing the primary source of grain to feed the city of Rome itself, and perhaps even more importantly, it cut off one of the last reliable major sources of tax revenue for the Western central government.
Came over, economically speaking. Without African grain and taxes, the Western Empire just couldn't sustain itself. And the Vandals rubbed it in later, didn't they?
They did. They famously sacked Rome themselves in 455 AD. While the Visigoth sack in 410 was shocking, the Vandal sack, combined with the permanent loss of that vital economic base in Africa, just confirmed Rome's complete impotence in the West.
We should also briefly mention the role of the indigenous North Africans, the Amazi or Berbers. Not really invaders in the same way, but part of that disintegration.
Right, their role is complex. They weren't a unified force marching on Rome. But As Roman authority weakened in North Africa, as troops were pulled back, local Amazigh groups and leaders saw their chance. They resisted Roman rule, expanded their own influence, carved out their own territories. They exploited the chaos and definitely contributed to the difficulty the Romans and later the Vandals had in fully controlling those provinces. They played a key part in that fragmentation.
Okay. To my loyal viewers, I urge you to subscribe and like the video. Your support is paramount to our kingdom's legacy.